Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching another episode of the Weaviate Podcast. I'm super excited to welcome Vibs Abhishek. Vibs is the CEO and founder of Alltius, which has created some amazing products like No Plus, and Vibs is also a professor at business school at UC Irvine, covering things around information systems and AI. So I'm so excited to explore these topics with Vibs. Vibs, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kana. It's wonderful to be on the podcast. I'm a big fan of Weaviate. We've been using it ever since we started building Altius. So it's a pleasure to be on this podcast. I'll give you a quick background about myself. I've been doing AI for probably like 25 years or so. I don't look that old, but I am quite old. And probably the last 15 years, I've been doing a lot of research on AI and teaching AI at schools like UPenn, CMU, and more recently at UC Irvine. Um, I think what's happening with generative AI is really taking the world by the storm. But this is sort of a childhood dream coming true for me. This is what I wanted AI to do when I started working with AI when I was a kid almost. Uh, we can create these agents that have magical properties. They can tell stories. They can do cool things. But more importantly, I see many applications of them in the enterprise space. Right? And so for the last few years, I've been teaching courses on NLP at UCI and at CMU. I've been working with large language models for quite some time. And the for me the inflection point was GPT-3 is how much power it had and how much it could do without creating these custom models for NLP, which is what people have been doing forever in NLP, right? And then that's when I started thinking of how can we apply this technology to solve business problems. And that was the genesis of Altius. How can we create these AI assistants that can help people in the workplace? Technology and the world around us is changing very rapidly, and we are not learning things any faster. So instead of trying to solve the problem of how do we learn faster, can we have these AI assistants that go out and learn on your behalf and can help you do different things, pitch better, talk to your customers better, improve customer experience, for example. And so that's what we have been building at Altius for the last 18 months or so.
Yeah, that's also exciting. I had a look around Altius's website and the blog post. I saw things like DARPA finalists for learning assistants. And yeah, overall, this kind of assistant platform you've built is so exciting. I highly recommend people watching this video go take a look at it. Quick 4-minute Loom video really gives you the overview. But so this perspective, I think you've created one of the most impressive user interfaces I've seen for managing multiple assistants or agent, whichever word we want to use,
Yeah.
right? Assistants, agents, but like
Yeah.
this kind of way of, I upload documents and then say I have my chat with docs agent, or I point it to my SQL database that has like, I don't know, sales data. And then I have my kind of assistant that does SQL queries. Can you talk more about your perspective on multiple assistants and how you might want to manage that?
Right. I think, thanks for pointing that out, Connor. The way we think about assistants is really they are related to a persona, right? So if you have a customer service rep, you have an assistant that faces that customer rep. If you have end user on your website, that's a different persona, and an assistant can be created to solve their problem. It can be an operations manager, and you have an assistant for that operations manager. So we have a fairly horizontal platform that we have created. Of course, we are going very deep into certain use cases around sales and support, where our customers find a lot of need. But our platform rests on three different pillars. The first pillar is knowledge, right? All the information that we can sort of understand and know to solve a particular problem, right? Or to do a particular task. And what we have been able to do is systematically try to build not only unstructured sources of information like PDFs and docs and whatnot, but more in line of that images and videos. We have image understanding, video understanding. But in the last couple of months, we have also been able to build in structured data. So you can connect it to APIs, you can connect it to databases, flat files, CSVs. And so, we believe that to do a task, right, when we think about this person trying to do something, that data might reside in many different places. How can we pull in all of that data, combine that in some meaningful way? So being able to access different types of data sources is very, very important for us. So that's one pillar for us. The second pillar is what we call the pillar of skills. Is once you have the data in, what can you do with that, right? So think of a Q&A assistant. That's a very simplistic assistant that a lot of people are building today. Is I have now all of this documentation, let's say PDF documents, for example, right? Can you answer questions on that? But it goes even beyond that in the sense that maybe a question, some pieces of information reside in a database somewhere. Some pieces of information reside in a document, like a policy documentation. And how do you pull that information in to be able to answer questions? So we think of these skills being run by different agents. And so that is our distinction between agents and assistants. An assistant
Hmm.
mirrors a persona, a real person, whereas an agent does a specific task, right? And assistant can be a combination of multiple different agents, right? And so you can have an agent or a skill that is helping you pitch, right? Create a pitch for your customers, or helping you solve a customer support ticket, right? So these are what we call skills, and behind every skill is an agent that's technically implementing what we talk about. And then we have this model of, we talk about channels, and this is where we make them available, right? So
Hmm.
uh, maybe as a consumer, I'm interacting with this assistant on a widget that's on a website or a mobile app. It can be something that's integrated in Slack, right? A lot of our dev tool companies that are our customers have a Slack or a Discord bot, and we integrate there. Or it can be plugged into your support system. I think it's quite wide in terms of, we want to make it as widely accessible as possible. So we have APIs through which you can make the assistant that you have trained available across multiple different sources. You can plug it into your front end. You can plug it into your core system to do something. So we keep adding these channels, but really we want to meet where the user is, right? With that philosophy.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow, that kind of knowledge, skills, channels. I think it's such a awesome abstraction. There's so much to dive into
Yeah.
there. I think yeah, maybe if we could kind of come back to the data part. I'm really and just kind of go through the full stack again with
Yeah,
maybe
of
more of
course.
a microscope. But the data I'm really curious about, like there's a lot of stuff around like data ingestion that's coming up. We recently, our last podcast was with Noom AI, where they're talking about keeping the source in the sync, destination in sync. So say you have you have your SQL data in, say, Postgres, and then you want to sync it up with your vector database, or all these kinds of different things. And so maybe if we could just dive into, like, I've seen the UI on No Plus for how I would upload my documents, or I also really really love this kind of like also using the web. So I look for a question and I can't answer it, maybe I do a web search and maybe I add
Right.
that result of that back into the knowledge. Could
Right.
we maybe just talk through kind of the concrete tools and perspectives on that kind of curation of the knowledge corpus?
Sure. So, I think we like what we realized very early on is we tried many different approaches, right? We started building very early in the space. So we tried everything from fine tuning a model to, what we have to RAGs. What we finally sort of decided is we would have to build something custom.
Hmm.
To both ingest the data. So if you think about even PDF documents, for example, there are many different types of PDF documents. So we use a bunch of different APIs just to understand, what is it, a presentation? Is it a user manual? Is it something else? How do we ingest that? So even for PDF ingestion, we have different ingestion APIs. And then if you think about integration with custom APIs or publicly available APIs, what we have been able to do is we can read in the the API documentation, get a token, and to some extent, I think none of this works 100% like we discussed last time, but we can get it to work 90%, and then with some heavy lifting, we can get it to work 100%. But so what we do is we have this ingestion framework that we have created that is custom or proprietary to us. Of course, we use LangChain for a lot of our orchestration.
Hmm.
But once that data comes in, it can go into, let's say, um, a vector database. It can go in a knowledge graph. The knowledge graph helps us basically cross-reference stuff. And when we can't find an answer in the vector database, we can go and look at one hop, two hop things from there on to pull information from the vector database, or vice versa, right? We sort of use that in a very in a very tightly coupled manner. But some of the API and the structured data that we have, we don't typically pull that in because some of our customers are huge customers with millions of transaction records or billions of transaction records. So there's no way possibly we can store that in any infrastructure that we have internally. But what we want uh, to do is have the ability to be able to query and pull this information as needed. So when we retrieve information, we have an agent that does the retrieval, which figures out, should I be looking at a vector database? Should I be looking at the knowledge graph? Should I
Hmm.
be looking at doing an API call to pull that information in? Right. So there's intelligence in the retrieval layer, and for most of this, we are not actually going really to an LLM to do it. Like, of course, the LLM is part of the querying and resolving from this utterance. How do you get to the source of the information? But we have not started even constructing the answer. So there's a lot of steps in fetching the right information, synthesizing it, cleaning it up before we actually send this to the LLM to be able to create the answer, right? Uh, for most part, the final LLM that we're using is for some kind of human-like answer generation, or maybe some higher order reasoning. Once we have all the information, we need to do some higher order reasoning to synthesize that information. But a lot of the retrieval is sort of our own core technology that we have built. And the reason we decided, I think, there are different ways of doing this. When we were building, we realized that for enterprise use cases, hallucination is a very, very big problem.
Hmm.
And we tried to solve it in many different ways. And finally, we realized that we have to really control the information that we're putting into the LLM uh, or the prompt to finally generate the answer. And the only way we could do that was through creating our own custom, you know, data storage, data retrieval, data recommendation layer to be able to do that.
Yeah, before moving on to skills and the second pillar, I really want to unpack this a little more. This kind of like SQL router, as Llama Index calls it, that's how I first became aware of the idea where you take a query like, what is the average age of country music singers, and you route that to the SQL database instead of the vector database. And so I kind of want to dig on this a little more. Like,
Right.
it sounds like you're combining vector search with knowledge graphs, and I know knowledge graphs with Cipher. I had quickly tried to learn it in like Sparkle, and I was like, but now with the LLMs, I suppose it's easier. So yeah, how do you manage that? Like, is there like a prompt template for how to formulate queries in each of the languages? You have to kind of retrieve the schemas, maybe.
Yeah. So, on that, currently we're using our own intent manager to be able to do that. And basically, the intent manager is simply, um, a classification model that we have built
Mm.
using BERT. But we tried doing that using the LangChain agent framework. It wasn't as accurate as we wanted it to be. Like it would, when it's supposed to go to the Q&A, you're supposed to go to the vector database and maybe try to pull from an API. So we ended up building this intent manager that's doing the routing for us. Of course, we keep experimenting. We take maybe three, four steps forward, one step back, because everything is evolving so quickly. That's the solution that's been working for us. I don't know if you have heard of other solution that works. uh, I think in enterprise the it has to work most of the time, right? I think, and so that really constrains us in terms of how much we can experiment, or what's a tolerance we can have, right, on some of these things not working.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful idea that like classifiers are the, the introduction to machine learning, but still just like one of the easiest models to train. And
Yeah.
but it also, I guess, it has this, like, I see the language models as they're so good at zero shot, they can give you the proof of concept, give you your MVP, but then when you want to, get it really running. So but this idea of classifying a pipeline, I'm so curious, like, so maybe this would be a good transition into skills, and we could come back because I understand skills to be, say, question answering or summarization, or reading from one of your blog posts about using Alltius for finance, and you have things like topic literacy, getting started, research, support, analysis. So maybe if we could talk about these skills, and then we could maybe come back to this kind of intent manager router classifier on top of that.
Right. So, so the skills are like really tasks that people need to do, right? So think about, I have a customer who calls in, they're asking me a question. How do I answer that question very quickly, right? So that's a standard Q&A type assistant, or a Q&A skill, right? Part of an assistant. Or it can be help me create a pitch for, let's say, some of our, we have a couple of insurance customers, and there someone will call in and say, hey, I am a 75-year-old man in California with diabetes, and I'm looking for an insurance plan that has good dental benefits, right? And so, very quickly, what we need to do is look at all the plans that are there, maybe 6,000 plus plans, figure out which plans match the benefits that this person is looking for, and then say, here are the plans. So, this is like just retrieval of that information, right? So, this is so maybe building on the Q&A skill, it just pulls up that information. But then there's another skill on top of that that can sort of say, help me pitch the plan to that customer, right? And how do you pitch the plan is a different type of skill, because this might require you to be in compliance with local regulation. You can say some things in California that you can't say in New York, and vice versa. You want to have a certain brand voice. You want to, maybe not even the brand voice. There is a sales manager who's your manager, and they want you to be selling in a certain way. So the pitch agent is then customized, or can be customized for that specific agent. And so that's the beauty of large language models, is we can have all of this parameterization mostly in English and say, here is a customer, this is what they want, this is how you should be pitching, this is the general framework for pitching. Now create a pitch for this particular customer, right? Of how do we sell this insurance better. So that would be like, that pitch would be a skill, right? And we give ability to our customers, which would be like these insurance companies, for example, in this case, how to customize and create that pitch skill for their particular use case. And I think that's why we're going deeper and saying, can we build skills for specific use cases for specific industries, which people can then very easily customize with adding in their own secret sauce to those assistants.
I guess is the first thing of like finding the right plan for you, the 75-year-old diabetes patient. It kind of reminds me of this, like when to use a classifier versus when to use embeddings. And if like you have like 60 plans, maybe it's better to use a classifier. But if you have 60 million
Yeah,
something,
yeah,
So I really like that nugget. But then what you were finishing talking on this, customizing the script. This is what I think is just so powerful about the language models, is in the traditional sense of fine tuning. Maybe you have this style and then you have some examples and you fine tune a model, but it's not as flexible to like, now I want to change it to do this. So yeah,
yeah.
I'm very curious about how you think about that kind of, how would you adapt it? Would you, have this, you change the prompt and then maybe you generate synthetic data and then you fine tune it and then compress it to make it, you know,
Yeah, I think it relies on a few different things, right? I think the way that we have architected our system, it is pulling in the right, because we have this huge backend that can pull in the right pieces of information. So one way is you take an LLM and fine tune it for a particular insurance customer on all their data, right? Typically, what we have seen is there's two challenges with this. One is we need to have an instance then for every customer, and if you're hosting a version of Llama 70B for every customer, it just our cost structure just goes out of whack very quickly. The second thing is, the bigger the model is, so the bigger models are better at reasoning, for example. This is what we have found out, and I think there are papers that talk about that. But they're also more difficult to change, because you need to update so many model parameters. So the way we get around this problem is saying, here is the data, and we become very good at retrieval and saying, okay, this is how you pitch a plan. And now for pitching a plan, this is how people have pitched plans in your company. We sort of summarize that, put that in the prompt, or it can even be pulled up when we're creating the prompt at runtime. And then that is instruction that then goes to the LLM to say, this is the world, put blinders on, and then go and create the answer. And so that helps us really match it to the specification. Not only the data is very accurate and the answers are not, there's no hallucination, but then match it to exactly how that particular company wants to, or that enterprise wants to make it available to that end customer, right? And then we can add layers around policy and compliance and all of these things, so that the LLM does not, go out of bounds. And of course, we do some post processing stuff on the answers that are just generated to make sure that it is compliant and all, whatnot. But really, that's what is helping us, being able to generate the answers in the way that our customers want.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I think there's so much to this kind of conversation topic of like, if you want to have a language model for each of your customers, like maybe we're imagining some kind of like reinforced learning from human feedback where each of your customers is saying, I dislike this answer. And then you're tuning the language model. And there are ideas like maybe you have like the LoRa, the low rank adaptation. You have like these sparse parameters for each of
Right.
those customers. And maybe you do something like that. But then you also mentioned this idea of like the general reasoning ability. And if you fine tune your language model in this specific set of conversations, is it going to lose its ability to say, format the API request for the tools you might have hooked
Right.
it up with, as well as
Right.
this.
Right.
So I think all that is so interesting, and maybe we can come back to that topic as we come into agents. But I kind of want to round out this third pillar as well. The channels that you're deploying these agents into. So, like, I imagine a Slack bot or maybe something that reviews pull requests. Like,
Yeah.
what kind of channels are you thinking about?
Yeah. So yeah, Slack is definitely one of. In fact, that's the first channel that we started out. We did not even have a front end. Slack was what we started with, because I love Slack as a product, or maybe I loved Slack as a product before the recent refresh that they went through. Um, so we started out with Slack. We added the widget. Of course, we have our own playground where people can go in and sort of interact. I think that's more for the training purpose, not so much for end consumption, but some customers are using that for end consumption too. There is an API that you can connect to. We want it to be very low code or no code, because the target persona for us is business users. The reason we want to target business users is I feel there's a lot of power in language models. But if we are just depending on data scientists and engineers to bring it to the market, we just don't have enough people who understand these things well, right? So we want really to put them in the hands of business users, and that's why we have tried to create a very, very, you've played with the tool, it's very easy to use. But we do have that API connection that you can train the assistant and you can use it uh, to integrate with your front end or wherever you need to do that in your own workflow. We keep adding more channels. We are planning to add a Discord bot. We are planning to add uh, WhatsApp bot. So as and when we have requests from customers, we keep adding them. It's fairly easy for us to add new channels. So yeah, but I think the idea is, with the philosophy of making it available wherever the end user is, we want to be available in those places.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I guess like for me, I wonder with the enterprise customers and you have this conversation, do they have like some kind of, data lakehouse warehouse? I'm not super knowledgeable of the differentiation there, but like, and you sort of would say, you have all these different sources of data. I'm going to hook up like 50 agents to the particular sources. And then here's a chat bot, this GUI, you can talk to it when you like, or it'll send you
Right.
email. Yeah.
I think that's a general direction we're going. I wouldn't say that we can handle like 50 agents, especially 50 like agents that are querying databases. I think there is a little bit of a climb for that, but of course, like 5, 10 agents are not difficult to do. Typically, any assistant for us would have anywhere between 5 to 10, maybe sometimes even 20 agents.
Hmm.
Uh, but there'll be like some of them will be like more like Q&A. Some of them would maybe be like API agents, and so on and so forth. What we are also doing is earlier we had agents that could process different types. So like there was an image agent, there was a like a video agent. Now we're combining all of that into one and saying, okay, because we're putting all of the data in one in Weaviate, for example, with the right tags, we can have just one agent that can go and index all of the data. It has slightly different behavior because, when you answer from a video, for example, you need to be able to retrieve that segment from that video and show it in whatever the front end is, right? Whatever the channel is. But overall, I think we are consolidating some things on the agent side so that we don't have too many agents. But that's the vision, right? Like you should be able to connect it to as many sources of information as possible. And our routing mechanism then figures out where to go and look for that information.
Yeah, I think kind of like collectively settling on these abstractions around what's an agent and an assistant. So, to recapping for myself, the assistant, it has a persona, like you are a news chatbot or like you are a data analyst, and then an agent is like the skill. So
Right.
the agent is like the question answering or summarization. Do you,
Right.
with this kind of abstraction, do you see any kind of overlap, like when you're separating it out into skills, like question answering, summarization as being like two of the most canonical things that people
Yeah.
do? Like, do you ever find like the question answering model needs to summarize stuff, and so
Oh yeah,
within
that's possible too, right? So I think like again, just to recap the framework, right? Assistant is for a real person who wants to do something, right? And so really, what the assistant is doing is running a workflow, right? It's a set of tasks. uh, an agent is doing a specific task, right? So let's say, for example, um, I keep going back to this customer support and sales use cases, but let's say uh, I'm an assistant for a sales agent. One of my skills can be compare different products, right? And what that might require is for me to go and summarize product A and product B, and then do a comparison, right? So there is a chain of thought that runs, which is this is how we summarize A and this is how we summarize B, and then there's a comparison that needs to run, and that's sort of the overall comparison skill, uh, right? And that is just one of the skills that's part of that sales assistance, right? There can be another skill which is how do I negotiate price better? Give me a script to negotiate price better, right? So that can be another skill that the assistant can have, right? So our framework is fairly general in terms of how you can go in and create these skills. It's almost like Lego blocks, right? You have some primitives, you have like these tools that you can put together to create agents, right? And then you can put agents together, or skills and agents are synonymous in our case, right? You can put these agents or skills together to then create the assistant that that helps a particular person.
Yeah, I love the abstraction. I guess it's like you can think of like the question answer or the compare documents thing is like a tool, kind of like the API is like another one
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
abstractions, right? Is the
yeah.
tool. So I'm kind of curious, like when it finishes its compare documents, now it has this result. Do you save that result somewhere? Does that just go into the input window of the main assistant?
Yeah, so we have a dialogue manager that's doing all this orchestration, right? It will call if it, and the dialogue manager is the one that has the intent classifier also as a part of that. So it will call the different pieces, get the right information. It has some memory and that's not being powered by an LLM. That's like really like software that's doing all of more like, I would say something like Dialogflow, for example, like it's really that Dialogflow equivalent for us is that's the one that has memory and it's sort of storing all the intermediate steps and then trying to figure out what to do. Like even when you have a conversation, should it maintain context? Should it not maintain context? Right? Uh, when should it refresh the last three questions that were asked, for example, and figure out that we have moved to a different topic, right? So all that is being done by the dialogue manager right now.
Yeah, well, I was from our notes and preparing for this podcast, I was inspired to read more about this MemGPT paper, and I'm really glad I did because I think it put me in the right frame to understand this idea where they kind of separate it out into like the kind of like event part of the memory, which is like the running history of the dialogue, and as well as like the working context. And they
Right.
have things like when you search, you then have the search results, and it's like what do I want to then take to put in my in context memory, and so
Right.
yeah, I think that is this abstraction of like the top level has this like its own event queue, and then it calls this other
Right.
model that then has its event queue, and
Yeah. And that's a
yeah,
very, I just saw your podcast on MemGPT. It looks very fascinating. And, that's one of the things that I've been thinking about is can we instruct, our, like, no, for example, to retain some things in memory, right? And so I ask a question, I said, okay, retain this in memory. I ask a second question, I say, retain this in memory. And then when I ask a third question, and so this goes beyond context, right? I think one way that we maintain context is we just look at the previous interactions, like any like 1 to 5 interactions, right, whatever it is. But I think there can be a deeper way of thinking about this is there is like actual memory where we are putting stuff in, either automatically or by what the user is saying. Then we sort of say, okay, now answer everything else from here on based on what's there in the memory, right? And now flush the memory and forget that context. So I think this is an idea that we have been thinking about too, and definitely I'll love to read more about MemGPT. I just sort of got a cursory view at that from your podcast, which is very interesting. But yeah, I think these things are very like essentially, if you think of it, LLMs are just next token prediction machines. They're not full computing devices, right? Like you can't run an operating system, so to speak, right? You using LLMs. And so, how do we get it to that stage? Like, think of that as the chip, right? And the usual operating system parlance. But we still need to build all of these other pieces. And like RAG would be one aspect of this, right? Like you have some memory, but then you have the hard disk, and then you have RAM, and then you have all of these things. So I think we need to build all of these pieces
Hmm.
to make it really a powerful and a self-contained, computing machine, for example.
Yeah, I love that kind of like hierarchies of memory and the analogs of like RAM is in context, disk is like my vector database or my SQL. And
Right.
I guess one thing I really want to ask you about is so this kind of idea of I keep the history of our chat in my knowledge base, or maybe I do this kind of like GPT cache idea where it's like question answering, and you ask me a new question, and the vector similarity to one of the questions I've previously answered is above like 0.9, so I just send you that answer. But then I'm really curious. So that GPT cache idea is like I'm caching questions that real humans have come to my chatbot, my customer service, and they've actually asked this question. But I'm really curious if there can be some kind of offline processing where you give the LLM like 100 of your documents, and then I don't know how exactly how this is orchestrated, but it creates kind of like new information, like maybe new question answering pairs that it
Right.
like somehow has decided
No,
this would be.
that's it's an amazing point. So this is something that my co-founder Sid proposed a few weeks ago, and we have actually added this feature. It's in staging, it does not move to production, which is, can we create this FAQ list to begin with, right? So improve the cost, and also the response time, given a set of like especially in this customer support use case, we can do this, right? For generic things that are more generic, can we create a list of questions beforehand, and not wait for people to ask these questions that we start doing semantic caching on, for example. So that's actually an idea that we have actually implemented already. I think that's the fascinating part of this, right? Like it's like everyone is building in this space, and we're thinking of these new cool ideas. And so definitely it has a big impact on how fast we are able to serve these questions, because latency is a big issue. And like we have now probably hundreds of thousands of users, not current users, but maybe in an hour trying to access a system. So speed is becoming an issue for us. And so these are some ways in which we can actually solve that problem, and not really, at runtime rely on the LLM to generate these answers.
Hmm. Yeah, I love it from that perspective of optimizing latency and cost. I think that's kind of the origin of the GPT cache, and yeah, that automatically populate FAQ. It really inspires me into this whole, and I don't know if I've like done too much daydreaming with this kind of thinking, but like this way that you can use the LLM to generate synthetic queries, which then you could use to tune the system, because you can also have the LLM say, "Hey, was that a good answer to this synthetic question I came up with?" and it
Yeah.
can kind of like tune
So
itself. That yeah.
that's a very interesting point. One of my friends is a professor at UCI in CS, and he's done a lot of the seminal work in LLMs and understandability of large language models. And one of the ideas that he proposed was, how do we use the LLMs for be a fact checker, or even checking the quality of answers? We haven't done that at runtime yet. We do, I think some of the things, for example, when we try to maintain context, we are using the LLM to generate the question. We say, okay, here are the three previous responses. Can you generate a question which is a continuation question, but sort of create a self-contained question based on
Mhm.
what was asked earlier. So, but there are ways in which you can, offline process this and say, hey, tell me the quality of the answer. And the challenge is the two folds, I would say, right? One is typically you want the maker and checker to be different. Like, so you don't want the same LLM to be answering this question. It might be a little bit of cheating. Uh, but there are also certain LLMs that are better for this job. Like GPT-4 is much better at this than any LLM that we have tried out. When you look at quality of the answer, or doing some little bit of introspection, so to speak. Um, so yeah, so some of the smaller models are not good at this. Some of the larger models are better. And I experience GPT-4 is probably the best when it comes to sort of answering these types of questions.
Yeah, well, I don't want to like. I think maybe let's stay in the clouds and then we'll come back to some concrete questions. But when I was looking at No Plus, it kind of inspired me of thinking like like a notion for assistance, kind of. And so I was curious if maybe like someone in a different department, like all across the company, we have all these roles like product team, marketing team, sales team, and so like if their assistants talk to if the sales assistant talks to the engineering assistant to try to come up with these questions, and
Yeah,
if the the
I
assistant.
think that's we haven't thought about that. I think that's an interesting idea. Maybe we think about. I think it's an experiment worth doing. Doing, you add two assistants, and we had these. I think Google Home versus Alexa type interactions. Uh, it's possibly like it's doable, right? Like I think when we integrate something in Slack, for example, right, you have to address it, sets at no and whatever, right, at that assistant, and it'll answer your question. All we need to do is sort of put in two of them in the channel and see how they interact. That might be interesting, and I think that sort of gets in the line of automation, right? Like how
Hmm.
much of your task can be automated. We haven't started thinking in that direction, but I think it's a powerful idea of like our model of an assistant is very individual centric, but can we take
Hmm.
it from that and say, hey, can
Hmm.
we think about teams of different people interacting with like interacting through their assistants, right? That might be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's such an exciting direction of the future, and it brings me to my next question that I wanted to ask you, which is about when I was looking through No Plus, I saw things like how you have the attribution of sources in the question answering. So it's the Loom video. You ask it a question about the expense reports, I think, and it says, "Hey, this is the answer." And by the way, it's in this PDF. Just in case you
Yeah.
want to check it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, just your perspectives on the user interface design. Another recent Weaviate podcast was Charles Pierce from Tactic, and they have Tactic Generate, which is like a UI for comparison across multiple documents. And so I'm just really curious how you think about the kind of the creating of the user interfaces that coming to our last example, if we have agents that are talking to each other, I might want some kind of new way of
Yeah.
visualizing.
So I think it's a moving target. I would say definitely my like Sid is the one who's responsible for a lot of the thinking that goes behind the UX. Uh, but one of the principles that we have gravitated towards is making adding as much transparency as possible, right?
Hmm.
Because there is a level of trust that needs to be developed, especially in the enterprise use cases. People might be skeptical, people might be afraid of what's happening. So we want to give as much visibility to the customers, to the end users, right, and our customers as much visibility as possible. So I think that has defined a lot of the user interface. Uh, I think the ease of use has also defined a lot of the user interface, right? How do you go in? How do you create these assistants? Making it very easy for non-technical user to be able to do that. The choices of words that we use, the imagery we use, all of that is to make it very simple for folks to start using it. Uh, I do think that there is going to be a learning curve in terms of I talk about this idea of how do we move from a world of clicks to conversations, right? I feel it's a very important idea, not because I've sort of thought about it, but conversations are very natural for us. And even when we started Altius, and we were very focused on how do we create these assistants only for SaaS products, right? Uh, the the thinking that was driving my perspective at that point was, you know, for every tool there is a different language. We need to go and learn that language. This language is of clicks, and then I have a workflow that I can articulate in words, but then I have to convert that that workflow into the language of the clicks, right? So there are two fracture points, right? One is I don't know that
Mm.
language, and so I need to learn that language, and then I need to do that translation, right? And what these large language models have done by and large is, not they're not perfect yet, but I don't need to do that translation. I can say this is what I want to do, and the system understands what I'm trying to do, and then it does the translation, right? And hopefully there's enough data that the translation can be done, right? Think of a general transformer model. That's what it's doing, right? Converting from, like, it goes back all the way to Bert, right? Like translating from one language to another language, right? I think translating from a language to maybe machine instruction or clicks or whatever have you, right? uh, I think that's going to be the fundamental change that will happen in user interface design. I'm not much of a US expert, so I don't know what that user interface looks like in the future, but definitely will be very conversation led. I'm not saying that clicks will go away completely. I think we use that also, right? We ask people to click on things and verify things and whatnot. I think clicks are a good way to get very definitive input when you don't want to have too much ambiguity in what is being said, or the kind of input that you want back from the user. But there will be an interesting way to design these interfaces that you know I can only possibly imagine, but maybe I can't even articulate in words too much.
Okay, so I hope I'm getting this right. So with clicks, with going towards conversations instead of clicks, is this kind of like the workflow discovery, almost like RPA kind of thing, where you'd like, if I'm researching books about database internals, I don't know, and I'm on Amazon and I'm looking through the books, and so you kind of look at the clicks of how I navigate the user interface, and so maybe is
I
that
think that can be one way of doing that, right? That's probably what Adept started out doing. That this is what the user wants to do. This is what they, actually the clicks that they do on the page. Can we create a translation from that user interface to the clicks that they're making? But I think it can go even deeper, right? I think if we can have these API integrations, then we can just completely circumvent that layer, right? We can say,
Hmm.
here is what the user wants to do. Here is what our APIs are able to do. Can we, like, this is like exactly what's happening for text to SQL, for example, right? I type in a query, and then that gets converted into SQL, and then the right piece of information is fetched for me. I would say it's sort of, maybe that is the direction to go, and sort of you can then completely circumvent this, translating from what the user wants to do to clicks to then API calls, to just directly going to API calls, right?
Hmm.
But I think it will depend upon, I think there are a few companies that are trying to navigate that route too. Like, I think WhatFix is another company that's trying to do this. Adept was trying to do this. Uh, but yeah, I think conversations, I think that my insight is conversations will become more important in the user interfaces. And then they'll be figuring out from the conversation what actually needs to be done.
Yeah, I love it. I think the code interpreter for me has really helped me understand, like, like putting writing code into a chatbot. Well, I guess a lot of people probably already knew that with Copilot and stuff like that, but yeah, I could definitely imagine just even the comparison across documents, that it just kind of gives you the analysis in a chatbot. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's really exciting. So I think kind of a concluding that clicks instead of conversations, I meant, sorry, conversations instead of clicks is a really interesting insight. And so I really wanted to ask you this question. I think your, duality of background is so fascinating, to be CEO, founder of a tech company, as well as a professor at UC Irvine and business school. Can you talk about maybe like what that joint experience has taught you?
Yeah, I think I've taken a very non-traditional path to becoming an entrepreneur. Like, of course, what the academic background has taught me is, like, expertise in this particular area in natural language processing, large language models. Uh, Given that I'm a business professor, a lot of my effort for the last decade or so has been how to get value out of AI, and that's a very tough problem, right? Like I think you think about even forget about generative AI, but more traditional AI. A lot of these AI projects don't succeed, and a lot of my effort has been how do you build AI? Should you even build AI? And if you build AI, how do you deliver business value? So a lot of that. So I think all of that learning has really helped me think about use cases where what we're doing at Altius is meaningful and it's very customer driven, very focused on delivering value to customers, to output to customers, really tangible, real dollars, right? Whether it is on the revenue side or whether it's on the cost side of things. And so I think that has really helped me take a broader perspective, not sort of as a technical person saying, okay, this is cool technology, let's try to find out solutions of this, but really looking at the problem and saying, okay, how can we solve that problem using the technology that we had, right? And I think back when we started, then generative AI was not cool. So we are not sort of saying, okay, how do we build a generative AI startup? I think the problem that I started with was, I've taught probably 5,000-6,000 students by now. They struggle to use software. How do we help them learn this stuff sooner?
Hmm.
And then said, okay, seems like, after looking at a bunch of different ways, uh, generative AI seems to be the right tool to build that platform to enable them to learn things, right? And that's sort of that led to, okay, we not only can build tools for helping them learn, but it can be a true assistant to them, right? So that was the progression that we took as a company, right? And of course, then ChatGPT happened, and then the whole sort of, I think all of us are living in that world. But so I think that's really helped me make that transition, or I would say inform a lot of the decisions that we make at Altius on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I love that kind of like the dog fooding of like, how do I teach my students better while being an NLP professor? And then I think that transitions so nicely to kind of like customer service support tickets, which also is kind of like this education problem. And I guess for me, the big thing is with I think with the past before ChatGPT and large language models, and for me, it took ChatGPT. GPT-3 wasn't enough for me personally, but maybe we talk
Okay.
about that another time. But
Yeah.
like the you used to have this data labeling problem, like
Right.
to train a question answering model like BERT on a new customer service data set, you would have to have some domain expertise in that thing.
Right.
And now it seems like the large language models can really help you bootstrap data in a really novel way.
Exactly. I think that's the real, differentiator that, these are what we call GPTs, right? General purpose technology. So it's not general purpose transform, but general purpose technology that earlier in NLP, you would have to curate data for a specific use case. Even if you wanted to do something like classification using BERT, you would have to actually go and get data for that domain, for that particular use case, to be able to train a model on that. And I think what the GPT-3 onwards has done is you don't need that specific training data, right? You can get, I think it gives you a false sense of comfort. I would say you spoke about this earlier, right? It's easy to create a prototype, and you can get started early, soon, but it still requires all this thinking and fine tuning, and putting all the guardrails in place to actually make it production ready. So I would say it's generally in the right direction that these models are powerful enough that they don't need a ton of data to get started. So earlier you'll have to start from scratch every time you wanted to build an NLP model. Now you're probably 50% of the way there just because of the large language models. But you still have to do that heavy lift of how do you go from 50 to 80 to 90 to 98%, right? Uh, so I think that's why I say it gives you a false sense of um, accomplishment or success, but you still need to walk that. But at least you're able to start. A lot of people are able to start in that journey, which they were not able to earlier.
Yeah, so I guess my last question would be the 50% of the way there thing. I think that is just one of the most interesting topics. I bring it up on every podcast.
Okay.
Is this kind of like fine tuning zero shot thing, and I'm just curious, so do you think to get a really performant customer service, let's say for how to fix an airplane or something like
Yeah.
that. Like you have to fine tune it with gradients somehow, or do you think maybe you can just tune your knowledge base, tune your retrieval? Maybe that entails fine tuning your embedding or ranking model, but like this idea that you instead of needing to fine tune the language model, you can just get a really good context, and then the zero shot model could get to that 95%.
I think that's a tough question. Our stance is you can get a lot of the way there without fine tuning. Uh, like our experience has been that if you really want to fine tune, you need to have a ton of data to fine tune. Otherwise, it just it doesn't work. And I think it can be we don't know how to fine tune the model as well. So it can be our lack of knowledge. But unless we have thousands or hundreds of thousands of documents, for example, right? It is possibly you can get much better results by just some kind of augmentation of the LLM. Uh, uh, I think it also depends upon how diverse. Again, the LLM is in a certain I'll get a little bit technical here, right? Is in a certain space because of what it's trained on. It's trained on the internet data, and what space is uh, the other documents or the other context coming from, right? And if there is no overlap or there's very little overlap, probably you want to fine tune it even with the augmentation and everything. Uh, but I think it depends on how much of that data is. So I think companies talk about their data being private, but it doesn't like customer support data. Pretty much people are talking about similar things. Maybe the context is a little bit different, but it's not a very different vocabulary. Like think about two different languages, for example. If I've trained a language model on German and then I'm asking it questions in Hindi, for example, I'm not sure that it's going to do the translation, even if I were supplying stuff in Hindi to it, right? I think the current models are able to do some of that, right, translation, because there's so much diverse language and content out there. But I'm sort of making this very stark case that, you know, there needs to be a significant amount of overlap between what the language model is trained on and what your domain has data on, right? Um, and I think if there is significant overlap, maybe just using an augmentation works for reducing hallucination and whatnot. Uh, uh, and it doesn't have to be in the same time span, right? I think you learn the vocabulary. The vocabulary is consistent over time. The facts have changed, and that's why you need the augmentation. But if you're speaking a different language, then you need to do something to the language model.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic. I remember the wave where it was like bio Bert, legal Bert, and it was like domain Bert. Yeah, I guess like for me, I'm curious if like when, especially as they scale the context lengths to like 100K, if maybe you could give it the whole history. Like, there are different kinds of cells, like immune cells. There are T cells, and it's like the whole
Right.
description of it. And if you can just pack it in the general reasoner, can learn the language from the
Right.
context. But
I think it's interesting. It's an interesting idea. I think some of the papers that I have seen on this say that when you have very big token lengths, then it relies more on things at the beginning and things at the end, and sort of ignores stuff in between. Uh, we haven't done too many like we just started trying out Claude, so in a big way to sort of see if this is actually true or not. So we don't know yet an answer to that question. Uh, but I think I'll sort of take one step back. I would say these are very complicated models and they're not well characterized, right? I think of as
Mhm,
a computer
mhm,
scientist, you think about characterizations, right, of systems.
mhm,
These systems are very ill understood. Like if you think about a support vector machine or logistic regression,
mhm,
decision tree, we understand them well. We understand the
mhm,
mathematical properties of those things. Uh, Given how complex, like neural networks always has this problem, right? Forget about deep learning or even large language models.
mhm.
Even simple neural networks, we have not been able to characterize them very well, and so we don't know what the properties are of these models. Why does it forget the context in between? We don't know, and if we don't know, then how do we fix it? I think is going to be a challenge, right? And maybe we add some hacks to actually solve the problem, which makes something else. These are very complex systems, right? You change something here, the whole network sort of can collapse potentially, right? So I think I feel, as a scientist, this is a great time to be alive to just characterize how these systems work. But as a practitioner, I think, we're just trying to learn how to make things do the, learn LLMs do the things that we need them to do, right? So, but it's I would say it's a fascinating time to be building in this space.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Vibs, thank you so much for joining the Weaviate podcast. It was so interesting learning about these three pillars around knowledge base, skills, and channels. I love that abstraction, as well as how you separate assistants and agents, this description of the hierarchy of assistants you could have. And I was so impressed by looking through the No Plus platform. I think it's
Thank
just
you
one
so
of
much.
the best UIs of how you've captured all these different assistants. So thank you so much for joining the podcast. I love this conversation and learned so much.
Thank you so much, Connor. Thanks for having me on this podcast. It was wonderful talking to you.